Well, I'm grateful for those kind words of introduction and welcome. I'm grateful that you applauded before my talk. That exempts me from having to conform to high standards. I'm grateful to be here and a part of this wonderful occasion, the 100th anniversary of Erasmus University. And we might remark, as indeed we've just been told, also the 50th anniversary of a process of expansion to include a fuller range of faculties and not only a larger size, but I think a commitment to a larger public impact. And this is what I want to speak about, the public mission of the university. One might ask, why a mission? And I will say something at the beginning and at the end, but the answer is only partly because I grew up the son of a minister, a vicar, and only partly that sense of mission, but indeed partly the idea that we have a purpose in our lives, that we do things because we have a commitment to some values or larger purpose, is something that was often made central to a religious orientation to life, but is not uniquely religious. And I think universities are one of the settings in contemporary society in which an exploration of this idea of our purposes, of what we make of our lives, is carried forward, and one of the places it becomes salient for secular society. But I think mission matters also in more institutional ways. I think that it's important to think about the purposes that we have for universities, to think of universities as a project, not just an inheritance or an entitlement. Academics are prone to think of universities sometimes as a kind of entitlement. We did very well on our exams as students. Therefore, we should be allowed to continue to have time for reading or research or arguments in coffee bars. The idea of entitlement is, I think, potentially a pernicious one. It reflects, among other things, a kind of aristocratic vision of the university from earlier in their histories, not the vision of a university as an opportunity to do something, to make a difference. And this is what I mean by the sense of mission. Finally, though, by a sense of mission, I mean that individual universities, not just the university as a large social institution, all the institutions that have that name in their title, but individual universities may take on some specific sense of purpose. We just heard about the idea that Rotterdam has committed itself to an agenda of relevance and of public purpose. I think that universities are apt to forget this, and I'll say a bit more about that. I think there are great standardizing pressures on universities, and the ability to choose in an individual institution, to choose a particular way of working, an emphasis, a style, a set of contributions, becomes difficult. And I'll say more about why as I go on. There's a lot to say, in fact, about the public mission of research universities. I won't try to say it all. I want rather to put the issue on the agenda to suggest why it's different from the sum total of private contributions or goods that universities achieve, and to point to a few of the challenges and opportunities we face. I hope that there can be some conversation to follow, because although it is a feature of universities to hold lectures, and although as academics we are trained to stand up and talk for 50 minutes at a time, universities may have their truer intellectual identity not in lectures, but in conversations and arguments. And I hope that we can continue afterwards with discussion, and I'll leave enough time. This talk would have meant something different, something very different, 40 years ago. Not to say 50, but specifically 40. 40 years ago, 1973, I was a student just making the decision to be an academic. And universities were at the center of large-scale protest movements. I don't know if those first 6 students at Rotterdam were among the protesters. But I do know that the Netherlands was not exempt from this era of widespread protest. Some of the issues were external to universities, an end to the war in Vietnam, say, or early stirrings of the environmental movement, or the avoidance of nuclear confrontation, East and West. But the university was at the center of protests and engagement, partly just because that's where students were, congregated, and intelligent, active young people are often core to social movements. But the university was also the object of protests and the object of an active engagement as students called for curricula to be more relevant and called for change in the ways universities worked as an agent of social reproduction, crucially in terms of class, but also more broadly in terms of other kinds of social inequality and in terms of culture. Since the early 1970s, universities have indeed pursued relevance of a sort, but not entirely of the sort envisaged by those protesters 40 years ago. The relevance has often been signaled by a shift of emphasis from the humanities and social sciences, and sometimes from even the most basic versions of natural and physical sciences to technology, medical sciences, business, and various professional fields. In other words, the search for a public relevance, the search for direct contributions in universities has been shaped less by the ideals of the earlier university or of the 68 to 73 kinds of era than by a turn in the world towards a set of concerns for economic prosperity, for careers, and for property, wealth. Universities remain central to the reproduction of the class structure, and there has actually been a dramatic intensification of inequality. In the 1970s, to speak of the public mission of the university might have meant to address the university's role in progressive social change. Today, it is more apt to mean what justifications can universities offer for claims on public budgets? And these are often understood, paradoxically, in terms of providing publicly subsidized goods for private appropriation. Now, I will organize the remainder of this talk in 10 points, relatively brief each one, though each one could practically be expanded into a talk, and try to suggest something of what I think is at stake and where a middle path and a good path might lie. First, we're well aware of the private uses of the university. I think in many ways over the last 40 years, we've become increasingly articulate about the private uses and private purposes and lost some of our ability to be articulate about a broader set of public purposes, and we confuse the two. When we talk about impact, as for example, in my new country, the government requires as a discussion in part of the research excellence framework. When we talk about public relevance, we often speak of the sum total of a set of private goods, of goods that are appropriated privately. So there's providing training and credentials to students to advance their individual careers. This is a good thing that universities do. It can become more of a driving pressure than many of us are comfortable with as we experience students and their families seeking what they imagine to be short-term career gains in applying to university. But it also is, nonetheless, a kind of private good. And much conceptualization of what universities do is in this terms. Universities have customers. The customers are students. Increasingly, in many parts of the world, the students must pay individually for their instruction, and they expect a career benefit, both what they pay for in the instruction and for spending several years in the university. And so this is measured in terms of their increased individual earning capacity, or very simply in their ability to get a job after graduation. Another kind of private use is to provide exclusive markers of status. Universities are status conferral machines. We're mildly uncomfortable with that some of the time, though we celebrate it at other times. Erasmus is about to convey a great honor to me, a marker of status. Graduations, right, achievements of all kinds, ranks as professor, and so forth, are all status markers. But one of the things that universities are called on to provide to the larger society is a variety of exclusive markers of status. Now, these are partly to impress future fathers-in-law, right? So universities operate a kind of marriage market, and they not only introduce young people to each other and allow a sort of benign setting for experimentation, but they also credential the future marriage partners in ways that their prospective parents-in-law can appreciate. Ah, you're marrying a doctor, good. Okay? Now, I don't think any of us intend to get rid of that, but we may notice that it is, again, a private appropriation. It is something carried by individuals. It may be perfectly good in society, but it's not a public good. Again, the production of intellectual property is an issue. Inventions or discoveries are important, but the idea that the production of new knowledge should be harnessed largely to patents and copyrights, intellectual property that entrepreneurs can make the basis of companies, is a shift and a challenge. The great sociologist Robert Merton, writing in the 1930s of the ideal of science, said science was inherently communistic. Now, I'm not sure we're all communists, and he wasn't even then. But what he meant was that science depended on sharing among scientists. And it's a very important thing to remember, because if we lose this capacity to share, to proprietarial knowledge, to the effort to keep knowledge to ourselves and keep it secret in order for someone to make a profit on it, we lose something basic about the way science works and the way the university works. Now, of course, universities depend on money, so we have good reasons, not least those of us in administrative positions, to look kindly on intellectual achievements that also generate income. But we should look carefully at the fact that this is a privatizing influence on science. Let me give just a further example of a piece of research that I think is impressive on this. Scientists, including natural scientists, biologists, so forth, have a strong view of science in terms of doing good science. And doing good science is participating in a collective enterprise that turns in part on the sharing of knowledge, on mutual error correction, for example. And universities are sometimes internal publics, and at their best are a kind of protected public sphere in which there can be debate, in which there can be critical comment, in which there can be independent views, and science can be improved. Right? Now, subscribing to ideals of science, that, for example, the best work always wins, that the intellectual arguments are the basic ones, is challenged in some settings by private appropriation. What I want to point to, and I want to cite a bit of research, this one by Walter Powell and Jason Owen Smith, is that universities themselves may become problematic hosts for this kind of public interaction. The Powell and Smith research concerns biotechnology. And what they find is that scientists in universities report more concern for the private control of their research, less willingness to share knowledge and skill than scientists in corporate settings. It's a surprising fact because the assumption is that the universities are inherently about this public knowledge. But the reality they find is that scientists in universities are very concerned with things like who is the first author, which lab team gets the discovery first and the basic credit and the chance to win a Nobel Prize. And there is, for example, less willingness of members of neighboring lab teams to help each other out in university settings than in corporate settings. Now, corporations are focused on one kind of private appropriation, but internally, partly through means like profit sharing, they create mechanisms to encourage everybody to help each other out more. Partly they are more flexible about the way reputations work. But in any case, the finding is important because it reminds us that we aren't automatically the good guys in stories about publicness or sharing. And intellectual property doesn't just mean the production of patented property, new scientific or technological discoveries for entrepreneurship. It is what we all claim when we claim to be the first, when we demand a sort of credit for our work, right? And it produces a variety of challenges in relations between professors and postdocs and students when there's not fair enough sharing of credit, or simply a competitive atmosphere. Finally, of course, universities produce another kind of private good, and I've been hinting at this already. They provide jobs for those of us lucky enough to work in universities. And I think that this is something we value a great deal, and we should. And we worry about the stresses placed on those jobs. We worry about productivity pressures and external evaluation schemes and cutbacks, all the sorts of things that threaten this kind of private good. But the response I want to encourage is a more public response. Now that we are more articulate about the private goods, for example, that we are clearer about what we offer through providing students with degrees that are marketable, than about the public goods produced by universities, isn't just an academic fact about us. It reflects a broader change since the 1970s. During the long post-war boom that preceded that decade, universities were seen as central to a progressive package that included social mobility and wider social participation, the welfare state, and economic growth. And these were seen as congruent goals, by and large, by those who controlled public budgets, for example. So it is no accident that it's in this period, at the beginning of the 1960s, that Erasmus expands. It's 1963 happens to also be the year of the Robbins Report in Britain, the report that led to the major expansion of the university system, saying that it wasn't enough for 3 or 4% of the population to get degrees, that talent and opportunity were both more widespread and universities should expand. And this happened throughout much of the developed world and indeed elsewhere. This was an era of optimism, and even if some of the promises went unfulfilled, it shaped much of the thinking about higher education. Some of the same ideals are still cited, but the package has changed. The period from the 1970s to the current economic crisis, basically from the previous large economic crisis of 74-75 through to the crisis centered in 2008-2009, was marked by a dramatic rise of finance, credit and debt and new financial instruments, a change in the way wealth was held, a decline in industrial activity as a part of society, a change in careers, a change in public budgets, a growing fiscal crisis of states, as states began to say they couldn't afford that welfare state package from earlier years, and in varying degrees look at budget cutbacks. The national stories are slightly different. More cutbacks, some places less others, different timetables in some places immediately in the 1970s, say with the Thatcher Revolution in Britain. This began. Other parts of continental Europe held out a fuller welfare state model longer. But almost no state now is exempt from this competitive budget pressure, and almost no country is exempt from a shift in the way public and private goods have been thought about in this context. The idea of public contributions has, in short, been narrowed. Ironically, it is sometimes stated all the more forcefully, that is, governments are more insistent that they are making a contribution from public money and they want value for their money, but the definition of the value has in many cases narrowed, often to economic value, but even there to rather narrow and short-term measures. So economic growth in general and economic success appropriated by individuals through career-oriented education and credentials, but also technologies and discoveries that, for example, enhance health or other aspects of well-being, become central to an idea of the way in which universities provide value in return for public money. And the public interest comes to be reflected only in notions of how much subsidies should there be and how much value do we get back, and fairness. Can public money be accompanied by regulation to make sure that universities are fair, that they are relatively equal in gender terms, for example, or in different regions of the country, or something. Now, knowledge is a public good almost inherently. Not quite, because you can restrict its circulation. But knowledge has a strong basis to be a public good, in the core economic sense of a good which is not used up when it's shared. Okay? A good which is non-rivalrous, Paul Samuelson's famous phrase, right? That when others have some of it, you don't lose what you have. Now, it's interesting that is a feature of knowledge, and it would imply that we would want to share it as widely as possible, since we don't lose anything by the sharing. Each of us who is a teacher is engaged in one version of that sharing. But at the same time, other features of the higher education system, its organization, for example, in the provision of status markers, first class or second class degrees, 9s or 7s or 6s, right? Its organization in terms of career credentials, licenses to be able to practice something, all create a reorganization of this away from that ideal of comprehensive sharing. And so do things like league tables and rankings, and the idea of positional goods. So what I want to introduce is simply the idea that there's a core notion of knowledge as a public good. I'll say a little more about this. But against it is, on the one hand, the notion of a private good, things that are appropriated privately, and on the other hand, the notion of a positional good. That is something that we have by virtue of our comparison to someone else. A brief excursus on this. How are universities like single malt Scotch? Well, they're both good, of course, but it's more than that. A study in the United States of the cost of universities finds that in this period that I'm speaking about, the 40 years from 1973 to today, the price of education didn't vary with inflation. It varied with the cost of luxury goods like single malt Scotch and Rolex watches. Okay? That is, it was sold to an audience that was buying a positional good, a luxury good in a way, but a positional good. Because single malt Scotch isn't just tasty. Part of the point is other people are drinking ordinary blended Scotch, and you have the good sense, the cultivated taste, to drink single malt Scotch. It's very much like the way that wine consumption has become a competitive exercise in being able to talk about wine. It's not enough to taste it and enjoy it. You must give competitive speeches to your dinner companions to prove what you know about wine, and then you must order at 50 or 75 or 100 or 1,000 euros a bottle. All right? Now, right? Most of us academics don't order the 1,000-euro wine. A few traders in the investment banking and bond markets in London and so forth have been famously ordering this wine just before the crisis. But the point is that there is an extended hierarchy, right, which is based on positional value. A very large part of the basis for the cost of the single malt whiskey or the more expensive wine is that it is exclusive and that you have to show yourself both able to buy it and able to appreciate it. Okay? And universities have become uncomfortably like this, more in the United States than in Europe so far, but some European policy designed to have universities that are competing with American ones in league tables and so forth, has some of the same potential to turn university education into a positional good, something that we have mainly to have a better version of it than other people. Okay? Now, this is not something that I think can easily be dismissed. As the director of the LSE, I don't say, who cares about rankings? I don't mind if we fall to 50th. Okay? No, I'm very pleased to be highly ranked. But I think that there's a basic issue about what our purpose is. Whether the ranking is in some sense a byproduct of that, you're doing well at your purpose and you happen to be highly ranked, or it becomes your purpose. And that's the positional good issue. So universities are engaged in knowledge production. And knowledge can be a public good, I think in many ways should be a public good, that the competitive credit seeking of science can be a motivation that encourages us to produce more knowledge and relatively benign, or it can begin to be tied into a private system of appropriation and be a problem. This is a set of issues that appears in many terrains. And let me just evoke some of the breadth of it. Right? I've already suggested we have the idea of a public good in this primary sense of unimpeded and non-rivalrous access, but there are other senses. The idea of public importance and the idea of being a good most effectively advanced in public. And this is where I think some of the risk comes for universities. Much of what we do depends on our ability to work in a public fashion, to do it well. It's not just a question of what is done with it outside the university and society afterwards. The challenge of proprietary research, of obstacles to participatory discussion, even of the way academic publishing works, are considerable. And just consider publishing as an example then, before I move on. Academic publication, right, is crucial. Publications are the gold standard, along with competitive research grants, for the evaluation of university faculty members, for promotions, for new jobs at different universities, in this sense. But the world of publication is in increasing crisis. And there are various different dimensions of this. There is a positional goods hierarchy of academic journals. If you are an economist, right, no number and no quality of articles in second-tier journals can make up for articles in Econometrica and the American Economic Review and the Economic Journal. There's a very strong pecking order, a very strong hierarchy of publication. This is in many places enforced by official lists of what are the good journals, or by attention to impact factors, or even by government declarations. It's a global standardization, and part of what makes those journals higher ranked is they get more global submissions and it's tougher to get into them. But it also is a removal from relatively national or local publics of the arbitration of what counts as good research. I suspect it will not be lost on anyone here that to succeed in getting published in an American journal, if one is writing about the Netherlands, requires such things as making sure that you don't ever present what you're doing as being about the Netherlands. No, it's about universal laws. It's about highly generalizable findings. If you say the Dutch case in your subtitle, you won't get published in those top journals. Now, if it happens that you use American data, there won't be the same problem because it's obvious to Americans that America is the universal. Okay? But what it means is that having a hierarchy of journals that privileges a few global journals, disproportionately American, as the most prestigious, has an effect of skewing the knowledge that is being valued most in the review process. Beyond just this national question about it, this impedes the way to a more open access. There is tremendous technological potential today to share knowledge better and more widely. And we have an interesting tension between the prestige and the career value of publishing in certain journals and the possibility of sharing knowledge in an open access format. And we have debates about how to have open access. Open access is now something nobody dares speak against, but people act against it. Right? So, for example, a proposal on open access, and a debate about open access in Britain, to a lesser extent the US, although the US is about to catch up on this, is referred to what it calls gold and green open access. The same debate is emerging in the European science establishment. Now, gold access has to do with a wider open access, right? That is, and a faster open access. So the idea of gold is that as soon as work is accepted for journal publication, it's made openly available. Okay? Green has to do with the idea that there would be some sort of delay, and that there might be some sort of restrictions, but mainly delay is the issue. This varies with science. Now, why, you might say, are we having this debate? Right? I don't actually want to take sides in gold versus green open access. I want to try to say the debate is cast in a way that reflects the problem. The short version of that is the assumption that journals need to be paid to provide work open access. That is, you must keep the same positional goods hierarchy of journals, but pay Econometrica and the American Economic Review to make articles open access. If you allow them the property right to have restricted access for 1 year or 2 years, then they can sell that and defray their costs, and the government doesn't have to pay them as much. If, on the other hand, right, it becomes immediately open access, then the payments must be higher. The journals are very largely owned by for-profit private companies, sometimes by professional societies, which actually depend on the journal profits to subsidize their work on behalf of their members in various ways. Okay? But the point here is that what blocks us from being able to proceed better to open access, what stops universities from saying, we should be the arbiters of knowledge, we can produce a review system, an editorial system that works to distinguish good work from bad, and we can make it available free to serve a public function, is actually a logic of private appropriation. And it's not just the profit-making character of the journal, it's our focus on the positional status goods of where we publish. Okay? So the Public Library of Science, an attempt rooted in the University of California system to produce an alternative open access journal publication, is up against a private library of science called for-profit journal publication. And we should recognize this in thinking about what's happened to knowledge production and whether it's serving public goods. Let me move on. When we think about impact and serving a public mission, and particularly when we're called upon to do this by governments, we're apt to think about public policy impacts. And I think this is important. So a basic way in which universities provide a public benefit is by giving an input into public policy formation. University academics advise policymakers. They advise sometimes private figures who are also engaged in public policy. As, for example, in, say, the economic sphere, there's more and more private policymaking, right? Associations of businesses in a certain field that self-regulate and formulate policies, this sort of thing. It's a very important thing. This expert knowledge that academics provide, and this is sometimes paid. Consultancies sometimes made available free as a public good. Okay? I applaud this. All right? This is an important remaining public role of universities. But I want to add to it public debates. It's often less clear to policymakers who are funding universities and to others that the public contribution of universities is to have a better informed public debate, not only to have expert knowledge in private helping policymakers behind closed doors. And it's important that universities make contributions to broader public debate, and that means seeing the users of the knowledge that universities have in social movements, in civil society organizations, in campaigns of various kinds, and in arguments above all. It's crucial that we conceive of our work not as producing entirely consensus, but as producing better informed argument. And here there's a tension, because there is a lot of pressure to try to produce state-of-the-art knowledge, implying that it will always be a consensus. Here is what the field believes. Here is what we have learned. And fields do have collective knowledge, but they also advance by arguments. If we are always in the position of trying to produce consensus-based knowledge, to present what has been agreed to, we are at risk of losing some of our ability to improve knowledge, because all scientific knowledge is provisional. And we sometimes fail to make this clear in public. Right? We wind up with public arguments that say, well, why should you believe in evolution? After all, it's just a theory. Right? A misunderstanding of what theory is a misunderstanding of what scientists would mean if they say evolution is a theory. That is, they might mean that there is debate over one or another mechanism, but broad agreement about the whole overall idea. Okay? But the notion that if there is not consensus, then science is not to be believed is a relatively widespread public notion and dangerous for the ability of science, of scholarship, of academic work to inform public debate. And informing public debate means something different from taking sides in it. It means raising the quality of the debate by providing knowledge that can improve arguments on different sides of an issue, by making the debate more productive. It's also the case that universities are good settings for arguments. That is, that one of the great things about universities is you can have arguments in them. It's one of the oldest, most enduring features of universities, back to the Middle Ages and the famous highly organized disputations that were part of academic life, theological questions. And it continues, but I think we have to keep it continuing, and that means that we have to be willing to embrace argument and difference as part of how we work together. We do not have a proper internal public if we all agree with each other. Right? We have to disagree and have productive arguments to work. Now, it's the case that when I speak of public, I often have used it as a sort of generic term, the public, and we all do this. But we need to recognize multiple publics and a variety of further challenges that come from the fact that there isn't just the public. We have internal academic publics. Disciplines may function to some extent as publics. There are national publics, there are global publics, there are a range of publics. So people may reach different kinds of publics in various sense. I want to point in particular, though, to the tension between the rise of global English and the use of national languages all around the world. I have the privilege of being a native English speaker, and my local language and the global language are the same. But it's an issue. And it's an issue because what academia comes to value most in terms of prestigious publication often disembeds and disconnects work from its local context. Even in the Netherlands, I suspect, where English is pretty widely read and spoken, the public debates are in Dutch. And so the question becomes how to value contributions to local knowledge and public debates at the same time as one values contributions that are assessed in national and international competitive evaluation systems. And it's a challenge. I was struck once as I chaired an evaluation committee of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem that academics who move to teach in Jerusalem from anywhere else in the world are required to learn Hebrew. It's a mandatory requirement. It's the Hebrew University. It's actually a university that was the center of the recreation of Hebrew. It's a national language in Israel. So all required to learn Hebrew. And there is no credit and promotion considerations for publications in Hebrew. Right? If your task as an academic is interpreted as informing the local public debates, that's like a hobby, an extra. Okay? Because your promotion review will be on publications disproportionately in English. There is something called the Jerusalem Index, which ranks all the journals in different fields. Right? And pretty much it says English is better than any other language. French is second, go down a list. Right? American is better than British. British is better than Australian or Canadian, right? And go down a list. Right? There is an organization to what counts as knowledge that, among other things, is an academic outsourcing of the capacity to make intellectual judgments from individual institutions to this larger arena. Now, again, this isn't all bad, but it's something to think about in this context. And it's a challenge to some parts of academia which need internal argument to advance science and to do error correction. Now, that can take place in the international journals. There are arguments in Econometrica. But there's also an enormous amount of conformity in terms of what is required to be published in these journals. And there's a certain amount of illusion. I'll just point to two bits before I move on. One bit of the illusion is that this brings impact. You're publishing in high-impact journals. That's why this should be evaluated higher. But in fact, 10% of the articles in these high-impact journals produce 90% of the citations. Most of the articles, even in the most prestigious and competitive journals, have relatively small impact. So very hard to get in, highly selective, but it's a small number of those that get in that turn out to matter a lot in disciplines, that have a long lifetime, that are cited years later, and so forth. And part of the issue is that there is a high pressure to produce work that is technically competent, that doesn't have errors, but may not differ from conventional wisdom very much. It may explain an additional 1% of the variance in a model. Okay? It may make a contribution. Right? But work that challenges the model is more likely to be rejected, to appear in a less prestigious journal, to appear somewhere else. And this is an issue. About half of the most highly cited articles in economics, it happens to be the field in which I know the research results, so I'm using it as an example. About half of the articles that are most highly cited are in journals that are not among the most highly cited. Right? They appear somewhere else, right, and didn't make it into the highest impact journals. But when they're found, they turn out to have a large impact. Sometimes 5 years later, oh, they were right, and all those other articles were wrong. Okay? So worth thinking about. Secondly, so you have to have argument for the error correction virtue of it. Secondly, there's an issue here about the growing number of fields in which there's extra academic knowledge production. One of the ways in which academic knowledge works these days is in a kind of co-production with people who are outside universities. And figuring out how to recognize this is important. The standard model of science from 50, 60, 70 years ago is at odds with this. The notion that there is a sort of pure knowledge that is produced in pure science, and then a process by which this gets applied and eventually becomes something very concrete. And it is passed outward from university-based academics to others. But in fact, one of the features of the expansion of the university system is that there are lots and lots of highly educated people in lots of fields. Access to data and ability to work on problems often involves a collaboration between people in and out of universities, and it often involves multiple purposes. So we need to account for that. Now, if advancing knowledge depends in part on its publicness, because advancing knowledge depends on criticism of knowledge and debate in order to push things forward, in order to correct errors, in order to promote new ideas, we need to think about how it's produced in this context. And I want here simply to stress how important problem choice is. That is, we spend a lot of time focused on methods, the theories people use, on findings, but a lot of the action is in problem choice, in formulating problems. And if we are in a situation where this is outsourced to grant-making agencies, then we are sort of chasing externally formulated problems, trying to adapt in many ways to problem formations. Almost every national science funder has shifted in some degree from investigator-driven research to setting goals, targets, topics for research from within the research agency. Right? So from saying that we will have peer review of investigator-initiated research, which simply tries to find the best research and support it, to saying, oh, well, we've agreed the 3 big problems are 1, 2, 3, researchers must submit on those problems. This, again, is externalizing something from the intellectual debate, and it creates a problem because part of the creativity of science is in reformulating the problem, in thinking about what's going on, in understanding where the issue lies, and we lose something there. A further loss is when this gets harnessed, as I've already hinted, to an audit culture, to league tables and rankings, to an idea of generic excellence. And there is a lot of talk, actually I've been very pleased in the last 2 days at Erasmus to hear almost none of it, of generic excellence. Erasmus actually has done an admirable job of avoiding this, which I applaud, but there's a pretty widespread tendency to just assume there's more excellent and less excellent, that there's some hierarchy of this generic excellence, and that we can know what excellence is without knowing excellence at what. And this is problematic in universities. It appears in things like the Jiao Tong, the Times Higher Education, the other major rankings of universities, which pull together a variety of figures, and they may make more or less sense, but which tend to produce an idea that there is simply a hierarchy of universities and that position in that hierarchy is the crucial determinant. Now, as I said about single malt Scotch, that's problematic in various ways, but it also leads to a tendency to substitute short-term for long-term work. It tends to university evaluation systems which essentially ask, what have you done for us lately, rather than have you done things of enduring importance. And so the tyranny of the rankings can be a problem. Advancement of knowledge isn't our only task, or rather, creation of new knowledge isn't the only public issue for us. It's also the capacity to know. That is, the very ability to know, to think, to analyze, to work. So research is very important, new knowledge is very important. That's what we tend to evaluate in promotions and hiring. But so is scholarship, so is knowing. Lord Robbins himself, the author of Robbins' report, The Expansion of Higher Education, asked what he thought its impact had been. He said, well, there was a good story, expansion of higher education. We were in favor of that. It was one of our recommendations. They didn't follow our second recommendation. Beware of specialization. Make sure that expansion includes some countervailing forces to prevent it becoming academics talking to each other in ever narrower closed circles of specialists. But unfortunately, that's what happened to a very large extent. Highly specialized knowledge as a key to academic success without a corresponding reward system for people able to connect up different kinds of specialist knowledge. And I don't just mean the buzzword interdisciplinary, though I do think that's a good thing. I mean even within fields. There's almost no reward to synthesis, to putting knowledge together. The reward system is contributing new pieces within a tacit philosophy of knowledge that says knowledge is an accumulation of discrete pieces. You should pile up many discrete pieces, like having lots of marbles, rather than knowledge is based on integrated ways of thinking, right, that enable you to know and understand facts and the accumulation of previous knowledge. Moreover, universities have a big role in preserving and rethinking as well as discovering. And I just want to note in passing, this is the role of libraries, for example, and of lots of scholarship in universities, and I think it's a role that's at risk. I think universities are at risk of giving up this role in being a part of the preservation of knowledge because it's expensive and it's not tied into the current evaluation metrics or easily marketizable. Well, we can get online access, and they have a library somewhere else. Now, it's true that online access can substitute for and greatly expand what's available in physical print copies. But it's also true that someone somewhere has to be valuing the preservation of knowledge and valuing scholarship and the capacity to know and think. A lot of this comes back to money questions, adjusting to reduced government support, but also what there is private support for. And increasingly, the flexibility of universities everywhere, even those that are state-supported, depends on their capacity also to command private support. And this creates challenges. I think there's no way around it. I think universities should embrace this. I think there's no point whining and saying, oh, we wish we still had all the public money we need. But there's a big point to thinking about how you use private resources, how you manage the need to develop private resources, and what it does to the public mission of the university. These are largely challenges that universities aren't facing very much. Right? They're trying to take the money where they can find it, and they wind up drawn to technical and career-oriented fields at the expense of fields that are not technical and career-oriented. A critical perspective is part of what universities maintain. And this is another thing that is challenged by a sort of client-oriented fundraising approach in universities. That is, if very few corporations, I don't know, maybe you have some, I find very few corporations come to the London School of Economics and say, we would like a critique of our way of working, and we're prepared to pay you a large amount of money to produce it. In fact, it hasn't happened at all yet. Okay. Now, it's not that there is no self-critical side to corporations, and people do ask about their strategies and whether their strategies are sound, about whether they've adequately predicted financial markets or other sorts of things, not to make a caricature. But universities need to make sure that they have the resources to produce critical intellectual argument, critical perspectives, challenges to established knowledge, challenges to the standard knowledge of fields. And these include historical perspective. So I'm very worried about challenges to the humanities around Europe, in the United Kingdom, in the US, because I think without historical perspective and without a broader cultural perspective, social science and natural science knowledge will easily lose its critical edge, and it will not be as strong, and it will easily lose perspective that it needs and become narrowly technical. Global comparison is the same kind, but here there's a good trend, something to celebrate, not worry about entirely, although it has challenges, which is our ability to compare what goes on in different places and learn from that. And universities have gotten much, much better at this during the same 40-year period as we've gotten more global. But all of this has to do with thinking not only about what we think we know, but about, if you will, the conditions of possibility. What could be true and what other questions need to be asked to test it. You'll be glad to know I'm getting to the conclusion. And I've saved one of the most important things to say at this point. Education is at the center of what universities do. And if universities begin to reconceptualize themselves as think tanks or corporate research and development organizations, and don't put education at the center, there are problems both for education and for knowledge. First off, the biggest public impact most of us teachers will ever have comes through our students. And we should be clear about that. Yes, we appear on TV. Yes, we write op-ed articles in newspapers. Yes, occasionally we write that rare article that is cited 10,000 times. And even that's not a very big public, you have to admit. Okay? But, right, the biggest impact most of us will have is through the students we teach year in, year out, and how they will think, how they will confront challenges in their careers and as citizens, and what will go on. And yet, I think during this 40-year period, there has been a tendency to compete for student numbers, to recognize, and compete for student quality, to recognize that as a part of our positional competition, but to reward academics for research, not teaching, and to shift the way we think away from the idea that our intellectual debates might be part of setting up a course, might be part of rethinking a syllabus, might be intellectual collaboration, might be exchange with students that drives forward our research, that education at the center of the university can actually drive forward knowledge production, and that we could design education not to be as convenient as possible, which is what I take a lot of work to have been in recent years, not simply to be as attractive to new students, but also to be as intellectually stimulating as possible. A rather odd feature of academics everywhere I've known in the 4 universities that I've taught at is that academics use phrases like, I had some chance to really work today. During the summer, I can do some real work. Okay? In other words, right, they assume that their teaching is a sort of necessary evil that pays the bills to allow them to have some leisure time for actually reading, writing, thinking. Okay? Yet, of course, we could look at the education and say, how could we design it in a way that actually made it intellectually exciting and improved the work that we produce, as well as recognize the public impact. And this is very, very important, I want to say, a cautionary note near the end here, because I think it's not obvious that universities will continue to exist in their present form. I don't mean that they'll go away entirely. I don't think Harvard's going to disappear. It has $35 billion of endowment to sustain it, a lot of prestige. Right? What I do mean is that universities are bundles of several different practices. And there's no intrinsic reason residential education for students, scientific research, public outreach, right, the preservation of knowledge, archives and libraries, have to go together. They could be separated. Different parts of university activity could be separated. And there could be losses. So if we operate universities on the basis of residential education, that is full-time students, and particularly in the 18 to 22 year age range and so forth, we need to recognize that we are going to have to justify that and justify the very high costs of that to a range of competitive models. This is for-profit institutions, it's less prestigious institutions, it's MOOCs and online education. There are a variety of other models for providing education. And an interesting catch is that the more our education is technical skill, the more vulnerable we are to that competition. Right? If what we are doing is training people in technical skills, then it can be done just as well by others and more cheaply. And we should worry about that. We had better be training people in something more than merely technical skills, educating them in a broader way, making it worthwhile to be a part of an intellectual community. I referred to the internal public at the university. It needs to be the case that there's something important about being here if we're to sustain an economic model that centers on having students and faculty together in places at universities. And I think this is crucial. I think there's great potential in online education. It will not just be MOOCs as they now exist, but various forms of using new technology will happen. I think universities should expand their adult education programs. Ironically, prestigious universities have gotten out of the adult education business during this 40-year period. The number of mature students, and I don't mean here PhD students who are 28, I mean people who are past usual university age, enrolled in the most elite universities, the global top 50 and so forth, has gone down precipitously during this 40-year period. Education of adults has been farmed out to a less prestigious class of universities to a large extent. And yet this is a big growth area. People live much longer. They change careers often. There's a huge demand for education and knowledge. There are opportunities for that co-production of knowledge that I signaled earlier if you engage with professionals at mid-career. There's tremendous opportunities in adult and mid-career education that could be very important to the survival of universities if we're able to integrate them into our educational offering. There are issues about altering the calendar and reach. A remarkable conservatism in universities has undermined one part of their public reach. We are pretty convinced that the method of delivering education is lectures, small group discussions of some kind, tutorials, delivered on an academic calendar during 9 months of the year, with 1 or 2 lectures a week from each professor, some follow-up from the students. There's no particular efficiency to this model. We have had a very hard time absorbing, despite many trials, short-term intensive classes. Right? Over and over again, these are tried, but academics are very reluctant, and it often appears as an intensification of academic work. But these short-term classes are often the ability to bring others into higher education and have a greater public impact, and they're worth thinking about. Now I'll close. Right? We take on all manner of secondary public obligations. And when we talk about the public impact of universities, we often talk about these. We encourage gender equality, environmental awareness. Right? There are a variety of things that are public obligations, just as we have an obligation to be ethical in universities. But the publicness of universities needs to be not things we see as extra, but internalized into our core understanding of how knowledge is produced, preserved, shared, and enabled to have an impact. This is, I think, what we do and value. It starts with an internal public. The reasons why it's so important to be inclusive, to represent the diversity in the larger society, to have gender equality and so forth, are not a bunch of ethical extras. They're intrinsic to this very public mission of the university. They're core. They're not optional extras. The reason it is important to reach out to non-traditional students, to not let the competition for the highest status students in the positional goods lead to a selectivity that relegates less well-off students to the bottom of the tier, is intrinsic to the public mission of the university, not an optional extra. Back to 1973, that question that was asked, reproduction or change, is still relevant. We still work in institutions that are overwhelmingly engaged in the reproduction of existing social relations, and only very secondarily in the facilitation of a public conversation about what could change. We need to be semi-autonomous in order to do our intellectual work. That means we need something like universities that create fields in which we exchange with each other and carry on arguments at a high quality, not debased in public. But this is not an entitlement. It's not a prize we won by getting high exam results. And therefore, we need to be clear about what we deliver publicly, and that what we deliver to the public is not just a collection of private goods, but in fact, the facilitation of the public being a public. That, I think, universities can be very, very good at, and we should be clear that we want to be. Thank you.